The bench at the 5th and Main bus stop seats 4 people comfortably. That Tuesday morning, it held exactly 2 Sam Whitlock at one end, his service dog Duke lying quietly at his feet, and Deborah Sinclair at the other end, as far from Sam as the bench physically allowed, one hand resting protectively on her 7-year-old son's shoulder, as though the 8 feet of empty wooden slats between them somehow weren't distance enough. Sam noticed. He always notices. 11 years of combat deployments and the 2 that followed learning to live with what those deployments left behind had trained him to notice almost everything, including the particular way a stranger's body angles itself away from you when they've already decided, without a single word exchanged, exactly what kind of man you are. He didn't say anything. He rarely does, in moments like that. He simply sat with his hand resting on Duke's broad golden head, waiting for the 7:15 bus the same way he waited for it 5 mornings a week, unaware that in the next 11 minutes, before that bus ever arrived, Deborah Sinclair's entire understanding of the man she'd refused to sit beside would come apart completely, and it would be her own son's life, not an argument or an explanation, that finally taught her the lesson. Sam Whitlock is 59 years old, a retired Army Sergeant First Class who served 2 tours, the second of which left him with a spinal injury from a helicopter hard landing that still catches him sideways on cold mornings, and a case of post-traumatic stress severe enough, in the years right after his final discharge, that he'd gone the better part of 18 months barely leaving his own house, except when absolutely necessary. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood outside Cleveland, the middle of 3 sons, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry to keep the 3 of them fed, and he enlisted at 18, partly out of the same restless small-town ambition that drives a lot of young men into service, and partly because the Army offered a kind of structure and purpose his own chaotic childhood had never quite managed to provide. He met his wife Carol during his first stateside posting between deployments, and the 2 of them built a marriage around the particular resilience military families learn out of necessity, weathering long separations and short, precious reunions with the same steady patience Sam brought to most things. Carol passed 6 years ago from an aggressive cancer that gave them barely 4 months from diagnosis to funeral, leaving Sam to finish raising their daughter Riley largely alone during some of the hardest years of his own post-service recovery. A task that had, in its own strange way, given him a reason to keep fighting through the worst of his PTSD when almost nothing else could have. Duke, a broad, gentle golden retriever now 6 years old, had been matched to him through a veteran service dog program during the worst of that period. Trained specifically to interrupt panic episodes, to physically ground Sam during flashbacks, to stand between him and crowds when the crowds got to be too much. Duke had, by every honest measure Sam could offer, given him his life back in a way 18 months of medication and therapy alone hadn't fully managed. That particular Tuesday morning, Sam looked rougher than usual, and he knew it. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. His jacket, a heavy canvas coat he'd owned for a decade, had a tear along one seam he hadn't gotten around to fixing. His eyes carried the specific hollow exhaustion of a man who had spent the previous 36 hours at a VA hospital bedside 3 counties over, sitting with an old friend from his second deployment. A man named Curtis Boyle, who had been losing a long fight with cancer and had, 2 nights earlier, finally lost it, with Sam holding his hand at the very end because Curtis had no family left to hold it for him. Curtis and Sam had served in the same squad during that second deployment, the kind of friendship forged in genuinely dangerous circumstances that tends to outlast almost everything else in a man's life, including, in Curtis's case, 2 failed marriages and a slow drift away from most of the family he'd started out with. Curtis had never fully found his footing after leaving the service, moving through a series of jobs and a considerable amount of hard living. And Sam had remained one of the few constants in his life across 3 decades. The two of them talking on the phone every couple of weeks, regardless of how much distance or difficulty came between them. When Curtis's diagnosis came 8 months earlier, Sam had made the 4-hour drive to visit him as often as his own work and Riley's schedule allowed, and when the final call came that his old friend had entered his last days, Sam hadn't hesitated for a moment about where he needed to be. Those final 36 hours at Curtis's bedside had been quiet ones, mostly the particular hushed, suspended quality that settles over a hospital room in the last stretch of a long illness. Sam had talked to him in the moments Curtis was lucid enough to talk back. Old stories from their deployment together, easy and familiar. The kind of shared history that needs no explanation between the two people who actually lived it. In the quieter stretches, when Curtis drifted in and out, Sam had simply sat, holding his friend's hand, doing the one thing he still could do for a man who'd given him considerably more than he'd ever managed to give back over 3 decades of friendship. Duke had come along too, resting quietly at the foot of the hospital bed for most of those 36 hours, offering Curtis, in his final days, the same steady presence he offered Sam every single day of his life. Sam had driven straight from that hospital to his own house, showered without really seeing himself in the mirror, and gone about the rest of his week the way he went about most weeks. Because raising a 15-year-old daughter alone doesn't pause for grief, however real that grief happens to be. He'd gotten Riley up, gotten her fed, and was now waiting, exhausted and unshaven and privately grieving a friend he'd known for over 20 years, for the same bus he took every single morning to the community center, where he worked coordinating job placement services for other veterans trying to find their footing back in civilian life. Sam had taken the position at the community center 3 years earlier, after several years working a series of jobs that never quite fit the particular rhythm his recovery required, and he'd found, almost immediately, that helping other veterans navigate the same difficult transition he'd once struggled through himself gave his own recovery a sense of purpose that medication and therapy alone had never fully provided. He met with veterans of every era who walked through the center's doors, young men and women just a few years removed from service. Older veterans decades into a civilian life that had never quite settled comfortably. Men like Willis, whose confidence had eroded under the weight of a job market that seemed to have no language for the value of what they'd spent their careers learning to do. He was good at the work, methodical and patient in exactly the ways the job demanded, understanding, from his own hard-won experience, that most veterans walking through that door needed considerably more than a polished resume. They needed somebody willing to actually listen to the full shape of what they'd been through. Somebody who wouldn't flinch at gaps in employment history or unconventional career paths. Somebody who understood, firsthand, that a man's worth was never accurately measured by how smoothly his life had unfolded on paper. He had, over 3 years, helped place dozens of veterans into steady, meaningful work. And he counted that work, without any hesitation, among the most genuinely fulfilling of his entire adult life, considerably more so in some ways than even the military career that had once defined him. Riley Whitlock is 15, sharp-eyed and quietly perceptive in the particular way kids often become when they've had to grow up a little faster than most of their peers. Watching her father navigate grief and PTSD and single fatherhood all at once in the years since her mother died. She had noticed, that morning, the specific exhaustion in her father's face, had asked, gently, whether he wanted to talk about Curtis, and Sam had told her only that he'd lost a good friend, that he'd tell her more once he'd had a chance to properly process it himself. Riley hadn't pushed, understanding from years of practice exactly which mornings called for questions and which ones called for simply making sure her father had a proper breakfast before he left the house. Their mornings run on a rhythm, built across 6 years of just the two of them. 5:30. Sam up first, coffee started. Duke fed and let out into the small backyard for his morning routine before anything else happens in that house. 6 o'clock, Riley up, the two of them moving through breakfast with an easy, comfortable quiet that doesn't require much conversation to feel complete. 6:40. Sam walks Riley the 4 blocks to the corner where she catches her own bus to the high school. Duke trotting alongside them both, before doubling back to catch his own bus at 5th and Main. Weekends belong to a slower pace entirely. Saturday mornings mean a longer walk with Duke through the small park 2 streets over, Riley sometimes joining them, sometimes sleeping in the way teenagers do. And Sam has come to treasure those quiet Saturday walks as one of the few stretches of his week where nothing at all is required of him except putting one foot in front of the other alongside a dog who has never once, in 6 years, needed him to be anything other than exactly who he is on any given morning. The 18 months before Duke arrived remain, for Sam, the hardest stretch of his entire life. Harder in their own particular way than either of his 2 combat deployments had been. He had come home from his second tour with a spinal injury that ended his military career and a case of post-traumatic stress that took considerably longer to properly diagnose than the injury itself. The specific, insidious way psychological wounds often hide behind more visible physical ones until they can no longer be ignored. He remembers, from that period, entire weeks that blur together in his memory now, days spent mostly indoors with the blinds drawn, unable to manage grocery stores or crowded parking lots, or even, on the worst days, his own front porch, panic arriving without warning and without any clear trigger he could ever identify and prepare for in advance. Carol had still been alive during the earliest part of that period, and she had carried an enormous amount of the household's daily functioning during those months, patient in ways Sam has never fully felt he adequately thanked her for before her own illness took that chance away from him. Riley, only 9 years old at the time, had absorbed more of her father's struggle than either parent ever intended, learning early on to recognize the specific quality of silence that meant her father needed space rather than company, developing an instinct for exactly how to move through their house on his hardest days that no 9-year-old should have needed to develop. Carol's own diagnosis had come less than a year after Sam's separation from the Army, a cruel piece of timing that Sam has never fully made peace with, forcing their small family to navigate 2 enormous crises stacked directly on top of each other rather than spaced out enough to properly grieve and recover between them. He remembers those overlapping months as a kind of fog, managing his own PTSD symptoms while also becoming his wife's primary caregiver through a diagnosis that offered little real hope from the very beginning, all while trying to shield Riley from carrying more of either burden than a 9-year-old should have to carry. Carol died at home, in the bedroom she and Sam had shared for over a decade, with Sam beside her and Riley, at her own insistence, allowed to say goodbye properly, rather than being shielded from the reality of it. It was, Sam has said more than once in the years since, one of the only decisions from that entire terrible period he has never once second-guessed that Riley deserved the chance to say a real goodbye, however hard. Rather than being handed a softened, incomplete version of her mother's death that she'd have had to piece back together on her own as she got older. The Veterans Affairs counselor who eventually referred Sam to the service dog program, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who had worked with hundreds of veterans across a 15-year career, told him during their very first meeting something he has carried with him ever since. "You're not broken," she said. "You're carrying something heavy. and you've been trying to carry it entirely alone, which is a mistake nearly every veteran I've ever worked with makes at some point. The goal isn't to make the weight disappear, it's to find better ways to carry it. The service dog program had been her suggestion, one option among several she'd laid out for him, and Sam had approached it with the particular skepticism of a man who had already tried several other approaches without much lasting success. The 8-month waitlist had tested his patience considerably, but the 6 weeks of joint training with Duke, once he was finally matched, had been unlike anything else in Sam's recovery, practical, physical, immediate in a way that talk therapy alone had never quite managed to be for him. He learned Duke's specific alert signals, the particular way the dog would press against his leg or paw gently at his knee when he sensed rising anxiety building before Sam himself had fully registered it. Duke learned Sam's own patterns in turn, the specific tells that preceded a flashback or a panic episode, until the two of them had built, across those 6 weeks, a genuine working partnership that Sam has never once taken for granted in the 6 years since. He remembers, with a clarity he doesn't often let himself revisit, the specific texture of the 18 months before Duke arrived the way ordinary errands like grocery shopping had become genuinely difficult, crowds triggering a hypervigilance his body couldn't seem to switch off no matter how many times his conscious mind reminded him he was safe. He remembers a particularly bad afternoon at a hardware store, a sudden loud clatter of dropped lumber sending him instantly, involuntarily, back to a stretch of road he still doesn't name out loud, his whole body reacting before his mind had caught up to the fact that nothing dangerous was actually happening. Riley, 9 years old at the time, had been the one who found him afterward, sitting in the truck in the parking lot, hands still shaking. And it had been that afternoon, watching his own daughter's frightened, confused face as she tried to understand what had happened to her father, that finally pushed Sam to call the veteran service dog program he'd been putting off contacting for the better part of a year. The 8 months on the waitlist had tested his patience considerably, but the 6 weeks of training alongside Duke, once he was finally matched, had taught him something about trust and partnership he hadn't expected a dog to teach him. Duke had learned Sam's specific patterns faster than Sam himself fully understood them, the particular way his breathing changed just before a flashback took hold, the specific tension that crept into his shoulders in crowded spaces and had begun, within the first few weeks, intervening before Sam even consciously recognized he needed it, nudging against his leg, placing a firm, grounding weight across his lap. Small acts of physical presence that had, over time, rebuilt something in Sam's nervous system that 18 months of talk therapy alone had struggled to reach. He looked, to a stranger glancing at him quickly, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, like a man who might be homeless. He was not. He worked 5 days a week at a small nonprofit community center that specialized in helping veterans transition back into civilian employment, a job he'd taken 4 years earlier, almost by accident, filling in temporarily for a friend who'd needed the coverage and finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had a genuine talent for the work patient, unhurried, able to sit with a discouraged veteran through a bad interview debrief without ever once making them feel like a lost cause. He'd stayed on permanently within 6 months, and the center's director often said, only half joking, that Sam had a gift for seeing exactly what a person actually needed to hear on any given day. A gift Sam himself would have credited entirely to years of learning to read a room the hard way, first in combat and then in the considerably different but no less demanding terrain of his own recovery. But Deborah Sinclair, waiting at that same bus stop with her son Ethan on their way to a pediatrician's appointment, made her judgment in about 4 seconds, the particular fast, unexamined calculation a certain kind of person makes about a certain kind of stranger, and she acted on it immediately, pulling Ethan toward the far end of the bench with a firm, protective hand and a murmured word Sam heard clearly despite her low voice. "Come sit over here, sweetie, not by him." Sam didn't react outwardly. He has absorbed considerably worse than a stranger's quiet dismissal over the years, and he had, if he was honest with himself, more pressing things occupying his mind that particular morning than Deborah Sinclair's opinion of his appearance. Duke, however, lifted his head slightly at the shift in the woman's voice, the particular alert stillness of a well-trained dog registering a change in the emotional temperature of a space, and settled back down once he'd confirmed, in whatever way dogs confirm these things, that the change didn't require any action from him yet. Deborah is 34, a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized firm downtown, recently divorced, raising Ethan largely on her own during the week while her ex-husband takes him most weekends. Her divorce, finalized just 4 months earlier, had been an amicable one as divorces go, though no divorce involving a young child is ever entirely without its own particular grief. And Deborah had spent much of that year rebuilding a version of daily life that worked for just the two of them, learning to manage mornings and appointments and the small logistics of single parenthood without the partner she'd built her adult life around for nearly a decade. She had married her ex-husband, Peter, at 25. Both of them young and optimistic in the particular way people are young and optimistic before life has had much chance to test the specifics of that optimism. The marriage had been, for the first several years, a genuinely happy one, and Ethan's arrival had brought both of them a joy Deborah still thinks about fondly even now. On the other side of a divorce neither of them had wanted, but both of them had eventually recognized as necessary. Peter's job had required considerable travel in the years leading up to their separation, and the growing distance that travel created, both literal and otherwise, had slowly worn away at a marriage that had once felt unshakable, until the two of them found themselves, somewhere around their 9th anniversary, essentially co-parenting a household they no longer shared much genuine partnership within. The divorce itself had been handled with more grace than many, both of them prioritizing Ethan's stability above whatever residual hurt or resentment either carried privately, and Deborah credited that mutual restraint for how relatively smoothly Ethan had adjusted to splitting his time between two households. But the adjustment had cost Deborah something considerable of her own. A new, heightened vigilance over her son that had crept into nearly every corner of her daily life since the separation became final. She found herself, in the months since, watching for danger in places she'd never once thought to watch for it before. A specific, anxious hypervigilance that she recognized, on her more self-aware days, as almost certainly connected to the sudden, singular responsibility of being her son's only present parent 5 days out of every 7. That heightened vigilance, she would come to understand only much later, had played no small part in the split-second calculation she'd made at the bus stop that Tuesday morning, the same protective instinct that made her an attentive, careful mother also making her quicker, in moments of uncertainty, to draw sharp lines around anything or anyone that felt even mildly unpredictable, without always pausing long enough to examine whether the unpredictability she sensed was actually real or simply a reflection of her own heightened, exhausted nerves. She had married her college sweetheart, Mark, at 25, and the marriage had drifted apart slowly over the following 9 years, not through any single dramatic betrayal, but through the accumulated weight of two people who had simply grown into different versions of themselves without quite noticing the gap widening between them. Mark remained, by every account, a genuinely devoted father to Ethan, and the two of them had managed, through real effort on both sides, to keep the divorce from becoming the kind of bitter, drawn-out conflict that so often damages children caught in the middle of it. Still, the adjustment to single motherhood during her weekday custody stretches had asked more of Deborah than she'd fully anticipated. A specific, grinding exhaustion of managing every morning and every evening routine entirely alone, that had left her. By that particular Tuesday morning at the bus stop, running on considerably less patience and considerably more defensive protectiveness than she would have carried a year earlier, before the divorce had reshaped her sense of what dangers she needed to guard against on her own. She is not, by nature, an unkind person. Her coworkers would describe her as generous, thoughtful, quick to help a colleague in a jam, but she carries, like a lot of people do, an unexamined set of assumptions about who deserves caution and who doesn't, assumptions she has never once had cause to seriously interrogate because they've never once been tested in a moment that mattered. Some of that caution had sharpened considerably in the months since her divorce. A new, heightened protectiveness over Ethan that came from suddenly being his only parent present most days, a responsibility that had made her, if anything, quicker to draw lines around anything that felt even mildly unpredictable. That morning, they were about to be tested in the most immediate way possible. Ethan, 7 years old and bored in the particular way 7-year-olds get bored waiting for anything, had brought a small rubber ball with him, the kind that bounces considerably higher and considerably more erratically than seems physically reasonable for its size. He was a bright, energetic child, curious about nearly everything, prone to collecting small objects in his pockets and asking a steady stream of questions that Deborah had, over 7 years, mostly learned to answer with patience rather than exhaustion. That particular morning, they were headed to a routine pediatrician's appointment, one Deborah had rescheduled twice already around her own work commitments, determined not to let it slip a third time despite the early hour and Ethan's obvious reluctance to be up and dressed this early on a school day. He'd been rolling it along the bench beside himself for the better part of 2 minutes, Deborah distracted by her phone, checking the bus tracking app for the third time when the ball finally got away from him entirely, bouncing off the bench's armrest at an unpredictable angle and rolling directly toward the curb, toward the street, toward the exact spot where a delivery truck was approaching the intersection considerably faster than the posted limit, its driver checking a GPS screen rather than the crosswalk in front of him. The whole sequence that followed unfolded in less time than it takes to describe it. The particular compressed, adrenaline-slowed few seconds that witnesses to genuine emergencies often struggle to accurately recall afterward. The ball bounced once on the curb, twice on the asphalt, and Ethan's small sneakers were already moving before any adult nearby had fully registered what was happening. His entire 7-year-old attention narrowed down to nothing but the bright red ball rolling away from him. Ethan went after the ball without a single second of hesitation, the way 7-year-olds go after things without calculating consequences, 3 quick steps carrying him off the curb and into the street exactly as that truck bore down on the intersection. Deborah's scream came a half-second too late to matter. She was still rising from the bench, still processing what she was seeing, when Sam Whitlock, 59 years old, exhausted, spinally injured, unshaven, and moving with a speed that defied every visible thing about him, crossed the distance between the bench and the curb in what felt, to the handful of witnesses who would later try to describe it, like considerably less time than it should have physically taken. A woman waiting at the adjacent crosswalk, an office worker named Patricia Nguyen, who would later give a full statement to police, said afterward that she genuinely believed for one disorienting second that she'd somehow blinked and missed part of what happened, so little time seemed to pass between the ball leaving the boy's hands and the rough-looking man from the bench suddenly, impossibly, already moving. "I've never seen anyone move like that," she told the responding officer. One second he's sitting there looking half asleep, and the next he's already got the kid in his arms. I didn't even see him stand up properly. It was like his body decided before his mind did. A second witness, an older man named Harold Estrada, who'd been walking his own small terrier along the same block, had captured the tail end of the incident on his phone almost by accident. Footage that would end up, 2 days later, on a local news segment about roadside heroism. Though Sam had declined every interview request the station sent his way, preferring the story stay exactly the size it actually was rather than growing into something performed for a wider audience. Estrada told the responding officer that the dog had reached the scene like it already knew, moving with the same startling speed as its owner, positioning itself protectively before the truck had even fully stopped. "I've had dogs my whole life," Estrada said. "That's not normal dog behavior. That's trained, purposeful, like the animal understood exactly what was happening and exactly what its job was in that moment." He didn't think about his back. He didn't think about anything at all, in the specific, trained way a soldier's body sometimes simply takes over when a threat presents itself, bypassing conscious deliberation entirely in favor of pure, practiced reflex. He reached Ethan with perhaps half a second to spare, scooped the boy up and off his feet in one motion, and pivoted his own body between the child and the oncoming truck, taking the brunt of the truck's sudden, screeching swerve against his own shoulder and hip rather than letting any part of that impact reach the boy in his arms. The truck missed them both by a matter of inches, the driver finally looking up in time to wrench the wheel hard enough to avoid a direct collision, though the mirror on the truck's passenger side clipped Sam's shoulder hard enough to spin him half around, and he went down onto the pavement with Ethan still gathered protectively against his chest, absorbing the fall himself rather than letting the boy take any part of it. Duke was there within a second, having covered the same distance Sam had covered, barking sharply, positioning himself protectively between the small group and the now stopped truck. The specific, trained alertness of a service dog whose entire purpose includes recognizing and responding to genuine danger. Deborah reached them a moment later, having covered the distance from the bench in a blur she would never fully remember afterward, and found her son sitting upright on the pavement, shaken but entirely unhurt, held safely in the arms of the exact man she had, less than 3 minutes earlier, refused to let him sit near. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, the delayed, overwhelming rush of fear finally catching up to a body that had been moving on pure adrenaline for the better part of 10 seconds, and she dropped to her knees on the pavement without any regard at all for her work clothes or the small crowd already beginning to gather around them. The truck driver, a heavy-set man in his 40s named Gary, had climbed down from his cab white-faced and shaking, repeating apologies nobody was fully listening to yet, more concerned in that moment with confirming the boy was truly unhurt than with any question of fault or blame. A woman walking her own dog on the opposite corner had already dialed 911, her voice carrying clearly across the intersection as she gave the dispatcher the address, and a man who'd been waiting at the same bus stop pulled his phone out to record the scene, though he lowered it almost immediately once he registered that this wasn't the kind of moment that belonged on anyone's social media feed. "Is he hurt? Is he okay?" she managed, dropping to her knees, hands shaking as she reached for Ethan. "He's fine," Sam said, wincing slightly as he shifted his weight off the shoulder the mirror had caught, handing the boy over into his mother's arms with the same careful, unhurried competence he brought to most things. Truck barely clipped him. "He's just scared. That's the worst of it." Ethan, already crying now that the adrenaline of the moment had given way to ordinary childhood fear, buried his face against his mother's shoulder, and Deborah held him tight, rocking slightly, her own hands still trembling as the full weight of what had nearly happened caught up with her all at once. It was only once she'd confirmed, with her own hands running over her son's arms and legs and face, that he was genuinely unharmed. That Deborah looked up properly at the man who'd just saved him, and the specific, sickening recognition of exactly who he was, the man she'd pulled her own son away from minutes earlier. Murmuring a quiet judgment she'd assumed he hadn't heard hit her with a force that made her own breath catch. "You," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. "You're the one." She couldn't finish the sentence, the shame of it too immediate and too large to push past. Sam, still sitting on the pavement, testing his shoulder carefully with his free hand, while Duke pressed close against his side, looked at her without any particular anger. The specific, weary grace of a man who has absorbed enough of this kind of thing over the years to no longer need it to matter as much as it once might have. "Ma'am, your boy's safe. That's the only part of this morning that actually matters." "It matters that I judged you," Deborah said, still shaking, tears now running freely down her own face, whether from the fear for her son or the shame of her own behavior. She likely couldn't have said herself in that moment. "I looked at you and decided you were dangerous, or unstable, or I don't even know what I thought, exactly. Just that I didn't want my son sitting anywhere near you. And you just saved his life. You threw yourself in front of a truck for a kid you'd never even met, after I wouldn't even let him sit on the same bench as you. You're not the first person to look at me on a hard week and jump to the wrong conclusion," Sam said, quiet and even. "Probably won't be the last either. Doesn't make it right. Just means I've had a lot of practice not letting it change who I actually am underneath whatever a stranger decides about me on any given morning." A small crowd had gathered by then, the way small crowds always gather around any sudden roadside drama, and a woman among them, recognizing something official in the situation, had already called for an ambulance, more as a precaution for Sam's shoulder than out of any real concern for Ethan, who was, by every visible measure, entirely unharmed. The truck driver, a middle-aged man named Gordon who worked for a regional delivery company, had pulled over immediately, shaking badly as he climbed down from his cab, and stood at the edge of the scene wringing his hands, repeating apologies to no one in particular, understanding, with the particular sick clarity of someone who came within inches of a genuine tragedy through his own inattention. Exactly how differently that morning could have ended. Gordon had been driving that same route for 11 years without a single incident, and the near miss visibly shook something loose in him that went well beyond the immediate scene. His hands still trembling badly enough that Deputy Ramos eventually suggested he sit down on the curb for a few minutes before attempting to drive anywhere else that morning. "I check my GPs at every light, every single time. Been doing it for years," Gordon told Sam, still visibly rattled. "Never once thought about what happens if I look down at exactly the wrong second. I'm going to be thinking about this every single day I drive this route from now on." Sam, once he'd caught his breath, told him plainly that accidents happen, that the important thing now was that everyone was safe, and that he hoped Gordon would take the morning as a hard but useful reminder to keep his eyes on the road going forward rather than carrying guilt over something that, in the end, hadn't actually cost anyone anything permanent. Gordon thanked him twice more before Deputy Ramos finally cleared him to head back to his route, and he would later, unprompted, request that his delivery company review its policies on in-cab GPS use, a small, concrete change that grew directly out of 11 terrifying seconds at a bus stop intersection. The paramedics arrived within a few minutes, checked Ethan over thoroughly despite his protests that he was fine, and turned their attention to Sam, who submitted to their examination with the patient, slightly amused tolerance of a man who has been checked over by medical personnel considerably more times in his life than he'd ever wanted to be. His shoulder, it turned out, had taken a solid impact, but nothing broken. A deep bruise that would ache for weeks, but nothing requiring more than ice and rest, and the paramedics, satisfied. packed up their equipment while a police officer took statements from the handful of witnesses who'd seen the whole thing unfold. The officer, a younger man named Deputy Ramos, who'd been 3 blocks away when the call came through, took Sam's statement last, and something in his manner shifted noticeably once he learned Sam was a veteran. The particular respectful recognition one uniformed profession sometimes extends to another. "My own dad served," Ramos said, glancing up from his notebook. "2 tours. Army as well. He's got a service dog now too, actually. Different program than yours probably, but same idea. Changed his whole life, the way I understand it. I grew up watching him struggle before that dog came along, so I know a little bit about what these animals actually do, beyond what people usually assume." "Then you understand better than most," Sam said. 22 years on this beat, and I've seen maybe 2 or 3 moves like that in my whole career," Ramos told him, closing his notebook. "That's training, not luck. You've got good instincts, sir." Sam thanked him for the compliment without making much of it, more concerned with getting Duke calmed down from the commotion than with any praise for what his body had simply done on its own without asking his permission first. Deborah stayed through all of it, unwilling to simply walk away from a man who had just saved her son's life. Understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly how badly she'd misjudged him only minutes earlier. Once the paramedics and the police had finished and the small crowd had begun to disperse, she sat down on the curb beside Sam, Ethan tucked safely against her side, and asked the question that had clearly been building in her since the moment she'd recognized him. "Can I ask what happened? Why you looked, why this morning was hard for you?" "You don't have to tell me. I just want to understand, if you're willing to share it, because I think I owe you that much attention at minimum, after how I acted." Sam considered her for a long moment, Duke's head resting warm and steady against his good shoulder, and decided, somewhat to his own surprise, that this particular stranger, having just watched him nearly get hit by a truck saving her son, had probably earned a more complete answer than most people ever get from him. "Lost a friend 2 nights ago," he told her. "Old Army buddy. We served 2 tours together, stayed close the whole 30 years since. He didn't have any family left, so I sat with him at the hospital till the end. Got home yesterday morning, showered, and just kept moving, because that's what you do, you keep moving, whether you feel like moving or not. Didn't shave. Didn't sleep much either of the last 2 nights. I know I look rough. I am rough this week. Doesn't mean I'm dangerous or unstable or any of the other things people sometimes decide about a man who looks the way I look on a hard morning." Deborah absorbed that in silence for a moment, something in her face working through a complicated mixture of grief on his behalf and renewed shame at her own earlier assumption. "I'm so sorry," she said. "About your friend, and about everything I thought about you before I actually knew anything real. Most people don't know anything real about most strangers they pass," Sam said, without any particular bitterness in it, just plain observation. "That's not always a moral failing. It's just how strangers work, most of the time. The trouble only really starts when somebody decides they don't need to find out more before they act on the little bit they think they see." Deborah sat with that for a moment, watching Ethan poke curiously at Duke's ear while the dog tolerated it with patient good humor. "I think what scares me most," she admitted, "is realizing how easily I could have gone the rest of my life without ever having to face what I did this morning. If none of this had happened, I'd have just quietly avoided you at that bus stop for as long as we kept crossing paths, feeling justified the whole time, never once knowing how wrong I was." "Probably," Sam agreed, That's usually how it goes for most people who make the assumption you made. They never get the correction. They just carry the wrong idea forward, a little more confident in it every time nothing happens to challenge it. Deborah nodded slowly, and then, glancing down at Duke, asked the question that had been sitting alongside her other questions since the chaos had settled. Is he a service dog? I noticed the vest, but everything happened so fast. Duke, Sam said, and something in his voice softened noticeably at his dog's name. Trained for PTSD support, mostly, interrupts flashbacks, keeps me grounded in crowds. Notices things about my own state sometimes before I notice them myself. He's the reason I can sit at a bus stop most mornings without it turning into a genuine problem. Some days are harder than others. This week's been one of the harder ones. He told her, because she'd asked, and because something about the morning's events had loosened his usual reserve, about the first time Duke had truly proven himself, barely 2 months after they'd been matched, when a car backfiring on a crowded street had sent Sam straight back, in his own mind, to a road he'd rather not describe in detail. His whole body locking up in the particular frozen terror of a flashback with no clear way out of it. Duke had pressed his full weight against Sam's legs, applying the deep, steady pressure he'd been trained to apply in exactly that situation, and had stayed there, solid and unmoving, until Sam's breathing slowed enough to bring him back to the actual street he was actually standing on. That's the day I understood what he was actually capable of, Sam said. Not just a comfort, a genuine anchor, every single time I need one. He knew something was wrong, Deborah said, half to herself, remembering the way the dog's head had lifted at her own dismissive comment. I thought he was just, I don't know, being protective of you. But he knew, didn't he? About Ethan and the truck, before it even happened. That's why he was up and moving the same second you were. Dogs like Duke notice things, Sam said. Sound, movement, tension in a body before it's even acted on. I don't know exactly what he registered in that half-second, whether it was the truck's engine or your son's sudden movement or something else entirely. I just know he was moving the same instant I was, and that's not an accident. That's years of training, doing exactly the job he was bred and trained to do. How did you two end up together? Deborah asked, watching Duke rest his head against Sam's knee. The dog's earlier alertness settled now into calm, watchful stillness. There's a nonprofit that matches veterans with dogs like him, Sam said. Took about 8 months on the wait list, and another 6 weeks training together once he was assigned to me, learning each other's signals. I was in a pretty rough place before he came along. Wasn't leaving the house much. Duke didn't fix all of that by himself, but he gave me a reason to get up and go outside every single day, and some mornings that was the whole difference between managing and not managing at all. What was that first week like? Deborah asked, bringing him home. I can't imagine what that transition is actually like. Sam considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things Deborah asked him that morning. Strange. Honestly, you spend months waiting, filling out paperwork, going through interviews to make sure you're a good match. And then suddenly there's this animal in your house who's supposed to become the most important relationship in your daily life, and you're both just feeling your way through it. First few nights, Duke slept right outside my bedroom door, which the trainers told me was normal, him getting oriented to my routines. Took about 3 weeks before he really settled into knowing my patterns well enough to start anticipating things instead of just reacting to them. Now he usually knows I'm about to have a hard moment before I do myself. The bus they'd both originally been waiting for had come and gone twice over during the commotion, and Deborah, glancing at her watch, realized she'd missed Ethan's pediatrician appointment entirely, a fact that seemed to matter considerably less to her in that moment than it would have an hour earlier. She looked at Sam for a long moment, working through something she clearly wanted to say but hadn't yet found the shape of. "I want to make this right somehow," she finally said. "Not because I think you're owed anything. I know you'd have done the same thing for any kid on that curb, service dog or not. That's just who you clearly are. But I did something genuinely unkind this morning, out loud, where you could hear it, and I don't want to just say sorry and walk away like that fixes it." Sam thought about that for a moment, testing his shoulder again, wincing slightly. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. But if it'd help you feel better about it, there's a veterans job placement center I work at, 2 blocks from here. We're always looking for volunteers, people willing to help veterans practice interviews, review resumes, that kind of thing. If you ever want to actually get to know a few more people who might, on a hard week, look a little rough around the edges too, the door's open." Deborah looked at him for a long moment, something settling into her expression that looked unmistakably like genuine resolve rather than simple guilt-driven politeness. "I'd like that," she said. "I think I need that, honestly, more than you need me there." She showed up at the community center the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and became, over the following months, one of the center's most reliable volunteers. Spending her Saturday mornings helping veterans polish resumes and rehearse interview answers, work she found, somewhat to her own surprise, considerably more meaningful than she'd expected it to be when she first walked through that door, still carrying the specific weight of her own worst morning. Her first Saturday there, nervous and uncertain how she'd be received given the circumstances that had brought her through the door, she was paired with a veteran named Willis, a quiet man in his 60s who'd been out of steady work for nearly a year and had grown visibly discouraged by a string of rejected applications. Willis had served 26 years, retiring as a master sergeant, and had spent the year since his separation from civilian employment slowly losing confidence in a job market that seemed, to him, entirely uninterested in the specific value of what he'd spent his whole career learning to do. Deborah spent 2 hours with him going through his resume, line by line, helping him reframe his considerable military logistics experience into language a civilian hiring manager would actually recognize as valuable. "I never know how to explain what I actually did," Willis admitted at one point, frustration audible in his voice. 26 years, and it all just sounds like military jargon on paper. Nobody outside the service knows what half these job titles even mean. "Then we translate it," Deborah told him, pulling up a blank document. "Not dumb it down. Translate it. You didn't just coordinate logistics. You managed millions of dollars in equipment and supply chains across multiple deployments with zero margin for error. That's not jargon. That's exactly the kind of experience any serious company should be fighting to hire." Willis had looked at her for a long moment, something in his posture straightening slightly, and when Willis landed an interview the following week, largely off the strength of the resume they'd rebuilt together, he'd come back to the center specifically to thank her. Visibly moved in a way that had left Deborah unexpectedly emotional herself, understanding, for the first time, in a concrete way, exactly what kind of quiet difference this work could make in a person's life. Willis got the job, a warehouse operations manager position that used nearly every skill he'd spent 26 years developing, and he stopped by the center a full month after starting, unprompted, to bring Deborah a small bouquet of flowers he'd picked up on his lunch break, a gesture that visibly embarrassed him even as he insisted on delivering it properly. "I want you to know, I've told about 6 other guys at my new job the same thing you told me," he said. "That the way you talk about your service matters as much as what you actually did. Nobody ever explained that to me in 26 years the way you did in 2 hours." Deborah kept the small, dried bouquet on her desk at the center for months afterward. A quiet reminder of exactly why she kept showing up every Saturday. She brought Ethan along more than once. Once he was old enough to understand at least some of what the center did, and Ethan, who had never once forgotten the man who'd thrown himself between him and a truck, took to greeting every veteran he met at that center, with the same wide, unguarded warmth, understanding, in his own 7-year-old way, that the people working through URSAMs at those tables were exactly the kind of people worth being kind to, regardless of how rough or polished any particular one of them happened to look on any particular morning. Sam and Deborah settled, over the following year, into an easy, unforced friendship. The specific kind that sometimes grows out of a single, dramatic morning neither party ever fully forgets. She met his daughter Riley eventually. At a small gathering Sam hosted for a handful of center volunteers, and the two of them got along in the easy way teenage girls sometimes do with adults who don't try too hard to be liked. Riley, finding in Deborah someone who asked genuine questions about her life rather than the distracted, obligatory kind adults sometimes offer teenagers. They developed their own small rapport. Deborah occasionally picking Riley up from school when Sam's work ran long, an arrangement that grew naturally out of friendship rather than any formal request. One of those afternoons, waiting in the car line together, Riley told Deborah something she'd never quite found the words to say to her own father. Worried it might add to weight he was already carrying, that she still sometimes felt like she was forgetting small details of her mother's voice. The specific cadence of it, the way she used to say Riley's name when she was proud of something. Deborah, who had lost her own mother a decade earlier, understood exactly the particular grief Riley was describing and told her, gently, that the details a person worries about forgetting rarely actually disappear completely, that they tend to resurface at unexpected moments for years afterward, a small, steady comfort Riley carried with her long after that car ride ended. Sam, in turn, became something like an honorary uncle to Ethan, a role he never once sought but accepted with the same quiet, steady grace he brought to most things life handed him. Ethan took to bringing his school projects to show Sam whenever their families crossed paths, proud in the particular, uncomplicated way young children are proud of small accomplishments, and Sam, who had raised only a daughter and never quite gotten the chance to watch a young boy grow through the specific stages of childhood curiosity, found himself genuinely delighted by the role, showing up more than once to one of Ethan's school events with Duke in tow, both of them a familiar and welcome sight by the following school year. Ethan asked Sam, at one of those school visits, whether he could bring Duke in to meet his whole class sometime, and Sam, checking first with the school and with Duke's own comfort around large groups of small children, eventually agreed. He spent a full morning that spring answering an endless stream of second-grade questions about service dogs, about the Army, about his old canvas jacket, which Ethan had apparently told his entire class was the exact jacket the hero had been wearing the day he saved him. Sam had corrected the word gently, telling the class that he'd simply done what anyone should do for a child in danger. But Ethan, unmoved by his modesty, continued introducing him to every new friend he made for years afterward as exactly that the hero from the bus stop, with the dog who always knew. She told it once, in particular, to a new volunteer named Angela, who'd joined the center after a rough stretch of her own, unemployment following a company-wide layoff that had left her considerably more anxious and defensive than she used to be. Deborah recognized something of her own former self in Angela's careful, guarded way of moving through the center that first week, and had pulled her aside over coffee to tell her the whole story, start to finish, hoping it might land the way she needed it to. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad about anything," Deborah told her. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that the people who come through those doors looking for help are exactly the kind of people worth getting to know properly. and that the version of a person you see in a hard, exhausted moment is almost never the whole truth of who they are. Deborah told the story more than once in the months that followed to new volunteers joining the center, always the same way, without softening the uncomfortable parts of her own behavior that morning. "I judged a man by how tired and unshaven he looked at a bus stop," she'd say, "and less than 5 minutes later, he saved my son's life without a single moment of hesitation." I think about that morning almost every single day. Not because I feel guilty anymore. Exactly, Sam made his peace with that part a long time before I did. I think about it because it taught me something I needed to learn, and I got to learn it in the best possible way instead of the worst. Most people who make the mistake I made never get the chance to see, so clearly, exactly how wrong they were. Sam's story reached the local paper eventually, not through any effort on his part, but through Deputy Ramos, who had mentioned the incident to a friend who wrote for the community section of the regional paper. And a reporter had reached out asking whether Sam would be willing to talk about what happened. Sam had been reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of his own hardest week becoming public reading material, but Deborah had encouraged him to consider it, pointing out that the story carried a message worth sharing beyond just the two of them, about assumptions, about veterans, about the specific trained partnership between a man and his service dog that had made the difference between tragedy and a genuinely good outcome. The article ran 2 weeks later, careful and respectful in its telling, focusing more on the service dog program that had matched Sam with Duke than on any dramatic retelling of the rescue itself, exactly the kind of coverage Sam had been willing to participate in. It brought a modest but real increase in donations to the Veterans Service Dog nonprofit that had trained Duke, and Sam received, in the weeks after it ran, several messages from other veterans considering the same program, uncertain whether it was worth the long wait list, and he made a point of responding to each one personally, understanding exactly how much that kind of direct encouragement had mattered to him back when he'd been the one hesitating. The community center itself saw a small but noticeable uptick in both volunteers and veteran clients in the months following the article, something the center's director attributed, at least in part, to the story putting a human face on exactly the kind of work the center did every single day without much public recognition. Sam found himself, somewhat reluctantly, asked to speak at a small fundraising dinner for the center that spring, and though public speaking had never been something he sought out, he agreed, understanding that the discomfort was a small price to pay for work that mattered as much to him as the center's mission did. Sam, for his part, doesn't tell the story much himself. He never has been the kind of man who leads with his own dramatic moments, and this one, despite how close it came to going considerably worse, is no exception. When Riley asked him about it once, curious about the shoulder that still ached faintly on cold mornings, he told her the same thing he tells most people who ask him about hard things. "People are going to look at you and decide things sometimes," he said. "Fast, before they know anything real. Some of them will be wrong about you. A few of them, if you're lucky, will get the chance to find out just how wrong, and if they're decent people underneath the assumption, they'll do something with that chance instead of just feeling bad about it for a day and moving on. That's really all you can hope for from a stranger, most days. Not that they never judge wrong, just that they're willing to learn, if the truth ever finds its way to them." Riley considered that for a while, sitting beside her father on their back porch, with Duke's head resting heavy across both their laps. "Do you think Mom would have liked Deborah?" she asked, the question arriving with the particular, careful weight Riley reserved for anything involving her mother. "I think your mom would have liked anybody willing to actually change once they realized they were wrong," Sam said. That was always her measure of a person, more than whether they got things right the first time. Nobody gets everything right the first time. What matters is what you do once you find out you didn't. Riley nodded, satisfied with that answer in the particular, quiet way she was satisfied with most of the things her father told her about her mother, small true pieces collected carefully over years into something that felt, to her, like genuinely knowing a woman she'd lost too young to remember fully on her own. Sam thinks, sometimes, about how close that whole morning came to unfolding as nothing more than one more quiet, forgettable indignity absorbed and set aside. The specific, familiar sting of a stranger's dismissal that he'd have carried for perhaps an hour and then let go of entirely. The way he's learned to let go of most things that aren't worth the energy of holding on to. He doesn't dwell on the what-ifs of that morning off in the truck, the half-second margin, how differently it all might have gone with even the slightest miscalculation in timing. He prefers, most days, to think instead about what actually grew out of it, the specific unlikely friendship that formed in the wreckage of one woman's worst assumption, and the quiet, steady work that friendship has since done, turning one hard morning into a genuine, ongoing good. He thinks, too, sometimes, about Curtis, about the strange, unplanned symmetry of losing one of the steadiest friendships of his life the same week he gained an entirely unexpected one. He has never fully articulated the connection out loud to anyone, not even Riley, but he has come to believe, privately, that Curtis would have appreciated the shape of it, that grief and its opposite sometimes arrive close enough together to remind a man that life keeps handing out both, in whatever order it happens to choose, and that the only real job left to any of us is showing up honestly for each one when it comes. Duke still rides the bus with Sam most mornings, still lies quietly at his feet at the same 5th and Main bus stop, still lifts his head at the particular shift in a stranger's voice that means something in a room has changed. Deborah sits beside them now, most Tuesdays, on the same bench where she once moved her son as far from Sam Whitlock as the wood would allow, and neither of them has ever once needed to mention, out loud, exactly how far that particular distance has finally closed.